Hi, my name is Suzanna Harvey and I'm one of the partners in the International Private Client team at Burgess Salmon. I'm joined today by John Barnett, one of the other partners in the team, and we are here to discuss key issues that clients should consider when contemplating a move to the UK. I'm going to ask John for his thoughts on some of the UK tax issues, and he is going to ask me about some of the immigration aspects. So John, if I can start by asking you for your top tip from a UK tax perspective for any client contemplating moving here.
Yes, I think the top tip is that the UK has some really complicated rules about what makes you tax resident or not. And we also have a tax year which runs from the 6th of April to the 5th of April. That can cause all sorts of issues if you don't plan ahead. It can mean between January and the 5th of April that you might have left the last place, but you're not yet resident here. Equally, for people who come to the UK maybe in later in the year, August, September, October, if they're not careful, they can find that they are tax resident from even before they arrive in the UK, and you can't always split the year. That causes all sorts of issues. If you plan ahead, though, it's perfectly possible to come up with some quite useful tax results. So that would be my number one top tip. Make sure you plan ahead. How about from the immigration side? What would be your top tips there?
It's a difficult question from an immigration side because there's certainly no one-size-fits-all answer to the best immigration route. Some clients don't require visas at all. I mean, historically, we've had lots of EU national clients that have been able to move here and rely on EU treaty rights, for example. Obviously, that's changing with Brexit at the end of the transitional period. And indeed, from January 2021, we're going to have a new immigration system that effectively aligns the treatment of both EU and non-EU nationals moving to the UK from that date onwards. But I mean, clients can look to business-related visas, employment, things like that. They can look to family visas, fiancés, spouses, other forms of dependent. And we've also got things like the investor visa. So there's lots of different immigration routes. I think the key point is to make sure that the visa that you opt for works for what you want to be able to do when you're in the UK. So, for example, there are some visas where you can't work. And likewise, there are some visas that if you come into the UK on those visas, it's difficult to switch in country if you decide you want to do something slightly different. And so it's worth taking those things into account when you decide which visa works for you. I'd also say that a top tip from an immigration perspective is just to make sure you tie your immigration planning together with your tax planning. If you're not careful, there is a risk that you might make a decision from an immigration perspective that actually creates a tax issue for you. So by way of example, we've had clients that have taken immigration advice before moving here, and that immigration advice has been perfectly correct. They've then come to see us for the tax side of the advice. And they've, for example, come into the UK on an investor visa and they've received a dividend or realised a gain in May of the tax year, and they've moved in June. And the issue that we've seen is that they've not realised that because of the slightly strange tax year that you mentioned earlier, 6th April to 5 April, that the dividend that they received or the gain that they realised in May, even though that was before they moved to the UK, could have triggered a UK tax issue for them. So certainly an absolutely key thing to think about is making sure that you look at your immigration and your tax planning together. I think we've both said that planning ahead is absolutely fundamental, both from a tax and from an immigration perspective. But would you be able to give a couple of the options and planning opportunities that clients have if they do plan ahead? Would you be able to give people an idea of what they might be?
Yeah, so one thing we haven't mentioned is that even if you are resident here, there's another status which is called resident but not domiciled in the UK, which gives a number of tax advantages. And if you're going to fall into that status, I would say there are three top tips before you arrive. Number one, get your bank accounts in order. Usually you'll want to have ideally three different bank accounts outside the UK, one for your pre-arrival funds, one for your income post-arrival, and one for your capital gains after arrival, and make sure those are set up first. Second top tip would be if you have assets that are already pregnant with capital gain, then don't assume, as some countries do, that it's only the gain after you've arrived that would be taxed if you sold or disposed of those assets after you've come here. You need to think with those assets about whether to sell them or possibly to sell them and buy them back, or otherwise dispose of them before you come to the UK. Otherwise, you could find you've got a much bigger capital gain. And then the third top tip is that if you have been resident in the UK at some point in the past, even if it's 10, 15, 20 years ago, some of the tax status from that time can come back and still be taxed in a new period of residence. So if you're in that situation, do look very carefully, for instance, at whether you need to bring things into the UK just before you arrive rather than just afterwards. What would be your top tips from the immigration point of view?
I think an absolutely key thing is just to understand what your long-term objective is, as well as your short-term goals. So, whilst there are a variety of different visa routes, and for example, some of them you don't need to be planning on spending any kind of minimum periods of time in the UK in order to qualify for those visas. So, for example, an investor visa, you can apply for that without guaranteeing that you'll be spending a set number of days, minimum number of days here. And indeed, you can renew that visa without demonstrating that you've spent a minimum number of days here. But if your objective is to get permanent residence at the end of the period, then you do need to be able to show that you've spent minimum time periods in the UK over the preceding period. And likewise, if you want citizenship at the end of the process, then likewise you will have to show that you've met minimum day periods for that too. And actually those minimum day periods are actually longer than the ones for permanent residents. So I think having an idea of what your long-term objectives are is actually really helpful in making sure that you don't come to the end of that period and think that you've spent the right amount of time in the UK and that you can make the application for permanent residence or citizenship, whatever it might be, and then find actually you haven't done. And also knowing your objective and knowing what you need to do will allow you to make sure you keep the records for that as well, which I think is another really important thing to be aware of from the outset. And another final point that might be worth mentioning, just because you brought up domicile, and I think that is something that isn't very familiar to a lot of people. Our domicile rules are quite different, but domicile is, as you've been explaining, very important from a UK tax perspective. And whilst obtaining permanent residence or applying for British citizenship doesn't in and of itself impact or necessarily change your domicile status, it is fair to say that it could have a bearing when you're looking at that. So our concept of domicile is based on an individual's intentions, and clearly the decisions you make around your immigration will also be based on your intentions, and therefore you just need to think quite carefully as to whether or not decisions you're making could impact your domicile and therefore your tax status. So that's another reason why we would highly recommend that people get advice on their tax and their domicile status and on their immigration status together, just so that they can make sure that any decisions they are making, they're fully aware of the consequences of those. And I think we've probably covered enough for today, so thank you very much, John, for joining me to talk those issues through. For anybody considering moving to the UK, we have a much more detailed guide on the Burgess Salmon website, along with some other articles and briefings which may be of use, so please do take a look there. Of course, if you have any queries, we would be very happy to speak to you. Many thanks for watching.